So if you recognize the people in these pictures, that means you're seeing people at two different ends of a spectrum of a period of American history for the press. On the left, and I'm guessing this is the more recognizable person, Walter Cronkite, named in 1962 as the anchor and managing editor of the CBS Evening News. And on the right, somebody who may be less recognizable, but who has been in the news quite a bit recently, Barry Weiss, who was named last week, I believe, as the editor-in-chief of CBS News. And they represent two very different styles of journalism. And I'm going to come back to this slide a few times because I think there are different ways to interpret what's happening here. But that's supposed to be a timeline at the bottom. My PowerPoint skills are not perfect, but that is 1962 to 2025. And we'll talk a little bit about what's happened in that time, how the mainstream press has in some ways undermined itself, and why there is a crisis of confidence right now. And there really is truly a crisis of confidence in the American press. According to a Gallup poll that came out last week, trust in the media is at a new low of 28%. So 28% of respondents said that they had either a great deal or fair amount of trust in the media. And that is a low historically. And I think there are a lot of reasons for this. And we're going to talk about what some of those are, what I suspect some of them are, partly because a lot of the research I do is as a historian of the American press. And I've particularly focused on the 1970s and on the idea of press criticism, people who critique the press with the idea of making it better, what we would call good faith press criticism, as opposed to bad faith press criticism, which aims to take the press down. Barry Weiss is the new editor-in-chief of CBS News, and she comes from a partisan background. She was an opinion columnist at the New York Times. She, depending on which version of the story, either left or was forced out because of her conservative views. On the opinion side, she says she was not allowed to express herself. She founded an independent publication called The Free Press, which has now been purchased. Combined with CBS News, and she has been put in charge, in part in a media deal that is meant to please the Trump administration so that CBS could have its mergers approved. This is an unfortunate situation because having a strong independent press is an important part of having a democratic society, a press that you can look to trust. And when you look at Walter Cronkite, 2 slides back, he was known, and this is a myth, but he was known as the most trusted man in America. We can talk about why that's a myth. There are a lot of problems with Walter Cronkite as well, but they were problems that seem so tiny compared to some of the problems that we have with the press today. Barry Weiss and the now rebranded MS Now, which until recently was MSNBC, both coincidentally released their 10 journalistic principles in the last week, and the Nieman Lab, which is a Harvard think tank for journalism, did a comparison of the two of them. And if you look through the principles that Barry Weiss has put forward for CBS, they don't on their surface seem bad. And if she were to carry through with a news organization that follows these principles, then I think we can trust CBS. However, a lot of the reporters who are working there are very nervous about the changes that may come. And we don't know exactly what they are. But if you look at this, journalism that reports on the world as it actually is, Journalism that is fair, fearless, and factual. They like the 3 Fs, the alliteration there. Journalism that respects our audience enough to tell the truth plainly, wherever it leads. Journalism that makes sense of a noisy, confusing world. There's nothing wrong with that. There's no real problem with this as a principle. The question is how these principles get used, because it may just be marketing in the same way that Fox News, which we will talk about it on one slide, marketed itself as fair and balanced, or says that we report and you decide, which I don't believe to be true. I would like to introduce you to 2 people. They are straw people. When I used these straw people in my class, these, by the way, were generated by ChatGPT. I used ChatGPT as a prompt. They did a very good job. We're going to call the one on the left my sister. We're going to call the one on the right my dad. Now, these are caricatures. Neither of these represents who these people really are. But they're useful for thinking about some of the crisis of confidence in the American press. So the my sister character, a straw man, or straw woman, I suppose, she is very loosely connected to the news. She's aware of things that are going on. Local news means a lot to her. She works for a school district. She has a doctorate in occupational therapy. She's a very well-educated person. You can tell she's very well-educated. But at night, she wants to watch The Bachelor. She wants to watch Green Bay Packers football. She wants to not think about the world. She's not very heavily engaged with the news. My dad, on the right, in his mid-70s, he is a retired corporate attorney, also very well-educated, worldly man, very highly engaged with the news and public affairs. He gets all of his news, 90% of his news, from one news source. I'll leave it to you to choose which one you think it is, but he gets most of his news from one place. And I always ask my students, and I can ask you, and you feel free to, during the question and answer period, give me your answer to this. I ask my students which one of these people is more problematic for a healthy news ecosystem and democratic society. Is it the person who's intensely engaged, but getting all of their news from one place? Or is it the person who's disengaged, who's not paying attention? And I'll bring this up over and over again over the course of a 14 or 15 week semester, and my students go back and forth. I mean, I think the real answer is both of them are problematic, but they're lovely people, nevertheless. And I think even the president has a little bit of this problem in the crisis of confidence of news. This did not get a huge amount of press coverage, although some of the press critics who I followed did point out this story and say that it needed more coverage. A couple of weeks ago, during an interview, President Trump was asked about the situation in Portland, Oregon. He has sent the National Guard to Portland. He has described it as a war zone, a city in flames, which it is objectively not. Now, there are problems in Portland, Oregon. It has a higher homeless population than it used to. There is some petty crime. It is a city, but it is not in flames unless you are watching Fox News all the time. And that is where the president is getting his news. He's getting his news from his advisors and from watching Fox News. And you see the quote in the headline there. Am I watching things on television that are different from what's happening? And yes, he is. He is getting bad news, possibly like the guy on the right. He's getting news that is showing old clips of rioters in cities. He's getting information that is twisting the world into one particular worldview. And that's a really problematic thing. But one thing I want you to keep in mind is 1962 is not the beginning of this. This is the end of a very long timeline. And there was a lot that came before this. The period of Walter Cronkite as the most trusted man in America is a brief blip in the American media system. Now, for somebody like my dad, who was born 1949, The world of Walter Cronkite was the world he knew almost his entire sentient life, right? He was 13 years old when Walter Cronkite took over CBS News. And so the idea that there was a single knowable truth, that in 22 minutes, that's a 30-minute newscast minus 8 minutes of advertising, Walter Cronkite could tell you that that's the way it is. That there's the news, now go watch Howdy Doody, go watch I Love Lucy. I don't really know which networks those are on, so maybe you're changing the channel if you do that. But in any case, that he could sum up the news. And that is the assumption that a lot of consumers of news have today, and a lot of journalists have too, particularly in the United States. But this period is what the press scholar and professor and former journalist Jeff Jarvis calls a parenthesis. This is one little bit. And if that's the only news ecosystem that you've ever lived in, what we're in now is really disorienting, right? And I'm 48 years old. I have also mostly lived in a Walter Cronkite world. But as a historian, I've seen a lot of what all of this is. And we'll talk a little bit about what some of that is, right? There are a lot of pieces of the American press history that don't fit in with a Walter Cronkite objective, and I'll make air quotes, objective way of viewing the news. From the very beginning, things have been different. And I'd like to problematize that a bit for you. So on the left here, this is a reproduction of something called Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic. This was the first newspaper published in the United States in 1690 in Boston, or as my students like to call it when they read this, Bofton, because of the S's looking like F's in old typefaces, as you see here in the Boston newsletter on the right. It published once. They published one issue and they were shut down by the governor of Massachusetts. The governor of Massachusetts in 1690, of course, being appointed by the King of England, not elected by the people of Massachusetts. And Public Occurrences, as a press scholar at NYU has pointed out, was published from the start with fake news. There were incorrect stories. There were lots of them. And they were meant to attack the King of France. They chose the King of France rather than the King of England because they knew they'd be shut down if they attacked the King of England. They were shut down anyway. It didn't help them. So from the very beginning, newspapers were not necessarily true. And then we get to the American Revolution. You may know Sam Adams. That's Sam Adams. You may know him from the beer. You may also know that Sam Adams is not the guy who's actually on the beer. That's Paul Revere. There's a picture of Paul Revere on the Sam Adams bottle. My understanding is they chose Paul Revere because they thought he was better looking than Sam Adams, which I think is mean to poor Sam, but there you have it. Sam Adams and his group was, of course, partly responsible for the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Tea Party. But for our purposes, it's important to know he ran something called the Journal of Occurrences, which was not a newspaper. He and the Sons of Liberty ran the Journal of Occurrences, which was a little bit more like what we would today call a newswire. It was a news service that provided stories to newspapers up and down the American colonies. And what it did was tell stories of outrage of British troops in Boston. All of the terrible things that British troops were doing to the Massachusetts colonists. There was some truth to them, but mostly it was outrage. It was meant to get people angry at the soldiers who were harassing Boston citizens. So the stories were exaggerated. Some of them were made up. There were stories of soldiers chasing children down alleyways with bayonets that probably didn't happen. We don't know for sure. Obviously, it was the late 18th century. But historians tend to believe that these things were at least highly exaggerated, if not untrue. And the question I'd pose to my students at this point when we're doing press history is that a good ethical trade-off? Is angering people in order to foment the American Revolution worth making stuff up and passing it off as true? And again, students don't necessarily have a good answer for that. The American mass media really traces back to the 1830s with the launch of a newspaper called the New York Sun, which was founded by somebody named Benjamin Day, which is a good mnemonic device because Day founded the Sun, Sun, Day, it's easy to remember. Benjamin Day, through the confluence of changing technology, people moving into cities, and higher literacy rates, was able to create the first mass market newspaper, the New York Sun. It cost 1 cent, and this era is generally known as the penny press era for that reason. There were a few competitors that popped up quickly after them. And the New York Sun was immensely popular. So it launched in the mid-1830s, and in the 1830s, they published a really groundbreaking series on science. One of the correspondents for the New York Sun discovered through correspondence with a real-life astronomer, a Scottish astronomer, who was studying, I believe, on the Cape of Good Hope, so very, very far away from New York City, using a high-powered telescope, that the moon was made of semi-precious stones, emeralds, rubies. And living on the moon were 6-foot-tall winged bat people, living in perfect harmony with bipedal beaver people who carried their young in their arms and built little huts, living in perfect harmony. The Sun sold amazingly. So they published more updates. They went on for about a week, 10 days. Every day, new updates from the astronomer, getting these by wire, and then they stopped. And then they moved on. Just to the next story, whatever it was. Now, at the time, science fiction was really popular. People were very excited about science fiction because technology was changing so quickly in the 1830s. You know, steamboats, telegraph, all of these things coming into being in the Industrial Revolution. They wanted to hear these stories. They were eager to hear these stories. What we don't know is what my dad and my sister would have thought of them at the time. And historians have looked at this too. And they point in part, so I've got a picture of 19th century New York City up here. This is Lower Broadway looking down toward Trinity Church out toward the harbor. And if you look right here, you may be able to read this if you've got very good vision. It says Barnum's Museum. So this is P.T. Barnum, the showman, the one who's associated with the circus. But he began his career as essentially, and I will use a grown-up word, a bullshitter. He was a professional bullshitter, and people liked being bullshitted. He used humbug, which is, I guess, a more PG term for that. You could go into his museum and see the Fiji mermaid, which he had made out of a fishtail and a monkey torso that had been sewn together, and put it in a case and said, look, we discovered the Fiji mermaid. And people would flock to see this. Famously, of course, he put up a sign that said, this way to the egress, and made it look like it was a really exciting place to go. But of course, it was the exit door, because egress means exit. And people would find themselves out on the street and have to pay to get back into the museum at that point. And so historians have suggested, and this comes from a historian named Andy Tucker, who teaches at Columbia University. She suggested that stories like the moon bats were humbug, and that people read them tongue-in-cheek. They read them for fun. They didn't necessarily read newspapers to be informed about what was going on around them. It was entertainment. It was stories that they told to each other. And this is the same period, of course, when people like Mark Twain were writing for newspapers, where they were telling tall tales, and people were just interested in reading the fun stories. So the line between truth and fiction in these newspapers was fuzzy. It was very slippery. And nobody really thought that newspapers were a great way to find out about the world. They were something to read every day. There was truth in them. There was some truth. There were stories about murdered prostitutes. There was actually the reporter who wrote the Moonbat stories was a crime reporter for The Sun, and he spent every night talking about the petty crimes at New York City night court. People wanted to consume it because it was fun, not for informational purposes. And then we get to the end of the 19th century, and we get these two guys. On the left, Joseph Pulitzer, and on the right, William Randolph Hearst. And they had newspapers that were a little bit more like what we would think of today. This is known as yellow journalism. They sensationalized news. Now, Pulitzer has a very good reputation today. Hearst has a less good reputation today, although Hearst's company, of course, still very much in business. Hearst really kind of dragged Pulitzer down. Pulitzer at the time of his death was considered to be equally sleazy to William Randolph Hearst. The reason they were called yellow journalists, by the way, has everything to do with a newspaper war. The reason it's yellow, Pulitzer, who had the biggest newspaper in the world, he was the most successful newspaper publisher in New York. His paper was actually called The World, had a cartoon that featured a character called the Yellow Kid, who was a sort of vaguely defined immigrant. There's a little bit of Irish immigrant in him, possibly a little bit of Jewish, possibly a little bit of Chinese. But he lived on the Lower East Side. They never said exactly where he was from. And his punchlines were always written on his yellow nightshirt, which is why these two are wearing yellow nightshirts in the cartoon. His catchphrase, which be prepared to roll on the floor laughing when you hear it, was Hully G. No? Hullygee, Hully G. They loved it. People loved it. And so when Hearst came to New York, he went to the cartoonist who drew this, a guy named Richard Outcault, and said, I will pay you double what Pulitzer is paying you if you'll come to my paper. And Outcault went over to Hearst's paper and started doing the Yellow Kid cartoons. Pulitzer, in a time of looser copyright restrictions, hired somebody else to continue drawing the same cartoon. So on any given day in New York City, you could pick up Yellow Kid cartoons in two different newspapers. That's why it was called yellow journalism. But what they did was jingoistic. It was made to attract attention. And most famously, Hearst took credit for starting the Spanish-American War in 1898. He didn't really start the Spanish-American War. It was not his doing, but he certainly wanted it to happen. As you can see in this reproduction of the New York Journal, this is when the USS Maine, as in the state of Maine, sank in Havana Harbor. That happened. The USS Maine did sink in Havana Harbor. Many sailors died. It was an actual tragedy. Hearst knew that it was the work of Spanish terrorists who had caused the Maine to explode. This image here is a diagram of one way it could have happened, as the guerrillas swam underneath, placed mines, and caused it to explode. I believe contemporary naval historians think that the reason the Maine exploded was that they put the kitchen next to the powder room, and I don't mean the bathroom, I mean the place where they stored gunpowder. So a kitchen fire that went across the wall, boom, ship sank. They don't know for sure, but it's unlikely that it was Spanish terrorists. But if you look at this, Hearst is offering a $50,000 reward. And I always ask my students to count on this, how many times $50,000 appears on the front of this. It's like 12. They're like 12 $50,000. Did he ever pay that? Of course not. no one ever gave the evidence that the USS Maine was actually sunk by Spanish guerrillas. So this is a period where there was not high trust in journalism. Now, there is a historian at American University who argues that this period was a decisive turning point toward the success of what we think of as the objectivity model in American journalism. That there were three possible ways journalism could have gone in the 1890s. One was this, yellow journalism, what Joseph Campbell, who's the historian, calls the action model. Pulitzer and Hearst wanted to make real change in the world with their journalism. So for instance, famously, Pulitzer really was responsible for building the base of the Statue of Liberty. He ran a campaign to get children to collect pennies. Those pennies paid for constructing the podium of the Statue of Liberty. Pulitzer sent his reporters out to try to solve murders before the New York City police were able to solve them. They wanted to do real things in the real world. So it wasn't all jingoistic, attention-grabbing stuff, but they wanted real change in the world. There was something called the literary model, where journalism could have gone in a very literary direction. There's a reporter named Lincoln Steffens who bought a failing newspaper with a bunch of his friends and decided they were going to turn it into a literary newspaper. They accelerated the failure of that newspaper. They tanked it within a year, but it was an interesting experiment. And Lincoln Steffens went on to become one of the models of investigative journalism, what we would call today the muckrakers, who I won't talk about because they were good. We're not talking about the good journalism tonight. But the third model was the launch of the New York Times. New York Times was founded in 1851, but it was in the 1880s, 1890s that it was bought by the family that owns it to this day. And they turned it into a boring newspaper. And that was intentional. They wanted it to be a newspaper that stood above this kind of reporting. There was an early campaign for a new slogan after the family bought it, where they wanted a new marketing slogan. The one that won is "All the news that's fit to print," still on the front page of the New York Times today. My favorite of the alternatives was "News that will not soil the breakfast linen," which was meant to be a double entendre. One, they used higher quality ink, so if you laid it out on your on your table, it wouldn't soil your breakfast linen. But also, it was supposed to be classier. They were not a newspaper that covered murdered prostitutes. They were not a newspaper that was going to be writing about moon bats. They were not going to be doing this kind of journalism, the yellow journalism. It was gray journalism. The New York Times is known as the Gray Lady, and partly because it was intentionally dull. It was supposed to be highbrow, and it's an attitude that I think has stuck with the New York Times even to this day, to some extent. The New York Times does not like to be exciting. There is I don't know if it still exists actually, but there was when Twitter was a thing, an account that actually monitored every time a new word showed up in the New York Times for the first time. So the first time the New York Times would publish any swear word would show up in the Twitter. It's very uncommon to see those even today. So what then are the current threats? My dad and my sister are dealing with this media world with a lot of different possibilities for what could be going wrong. Oh, my slides are a little messed up, but consolidation and government threats. So this has happened recently to some extent. If you look at the headline here, this is from a piece in the New Republic. 5 companies control 90% of the media marketplace. And that is largely what we think of as the mainstream media. But it also increasingly includes social media. TikTok, for instance, may get sold to a consortium that includes the new owners of some of these broadcast stations and Fox News, the Murdochs may be involved in this. So even social media may get swept up into this consolidation. What this means is people like my dad are going to become more common, because if there are fewer possible outlets, more people are going to be getting news from essentially the same place, even if it's under different cover. So I think that consolidation and the government threats of the revoking of an FCC license, for instance, are a real threat to American journalism right now. But there are technological threats too. Deep fakes are a real problem. Deep fakes are faked media videos that appear to be people talking. Now this is an AI generated video of Richard Nixon. And I'm not playing it here, but this was done on ChatGPT's new platform called Sora, which is an AI-generated video social media network. So essentially it is TikTok-style short videos, but generated entirely by AI. And in this video, if I were to play it, which I'm not going to, Richard Nixon addresses the nation, apologizing that he had just discovered that the moon landing was fake. And after you watch this one, you can watch a video of an astronaut on the moon, I forget which one they chose for this, removing his helmet and saying, "All right, cut. Boy, it's hot under this thing." And it's easy to fake it. And it's very, very convincing now. There are real and very good uses for AI, but journalists are very concerned about this. Because the casual viewers, my sisters of the world, aren't going to take the time to really look into which ones are true and which ones are not true. And the video of an astronaut on the moon taking his helmet off can look really convincing, and it can be shared very quickly. Social media and the flattening of the press has also caused huge problems. And what I mean by flattening is real news, fake news, partisan news, objective news, all look the same when you filter them through social media. So something that is a deeply reported 3-part investigative piece in the New York Times gets the same headline as something that is an opinion column in the New York Times, or something that is disinformation that was created by a bad actor. And as you're scrolling through, you don't know which is which. Now you can click through and read them, and you can get a pretty good idea, but not everybody does that. Media consumption habits are generally very much on the surface. And so there are things that I have read, and I'm a professor of journalism, where I was like, I don't know if that's true. Friends have shared videos with me in Instagram chats, and I think that's fake. And coming from very smart people. So that flattening is a real problem too, because when you see a print copy of something, you know a lot of work went into that. There's a high barrier to entry to publishing the New York Times. Question? Yeah?
You better define the word flattening in this regard.
When I say flattening, so the New York Times, I get the print New York Times on Saturday and Sunday because I am an old-fashioned person like that, and I want the crossword and be able to do it with a pen. And it is a thick, it's not as thick as it used to be, but it's still probably 3 inches thick. A lot of work went into it. You know that a magazine you pick up on a newsstand or a broadcast television production cost a lot of money, took a lot of time and effort. Something that you could put together in 3 minutes now looks the same when you see it online, right? The website, I put The Onion up here. The Onion, if you're not familiar with it, is a satirical website. They actually publish in print again as part of a subscription model. It's worth giving them a little bit of money. They're doing good work again. If you're an Onion fan, I recommend it. The Onion website looks the same as most real news websites. Now, The Onion is very clearly satirical, but it's not hard, and this is where I say low barrier of entry, to create something that looks like this. Most of my students could put together a website with this level of design. You can subscribe to content management systems like Squarespace that take just a few minutes to put something together that looks this good. WordPress. Professional publications use WordPress, but there's also a free version of WordPress. If you wanted to make a newspaper, but have it only online, you could do it, and it would look just as professional. Now, 10 years ago or so, when we were first really worried about actual fake news, before fake news became an insult, the one real problem was that fake news producers was that the writing was difficult. You had to spend time writing things in a style that sounded like news. The visual was easy. Technology had taken care of that. Now with AI, you can write a fake news article really quickly. It sounds pretty close to most people to human writing. And it's a problem for professors too. A lot of us don't assign essays anymore because they can write a B essay. It's hard to write an A essay on AI, but it's very easy to write a B plus essay. The real creativity is hard still, but those large language models are very good at writing something that sounds like news. In part because the news style, right, what we used to call the inverted pyramid, is a very bland, stripped down, objective, Associated Press kind of style of writing. And what makes The Onion funny is they'll have a ludicrous headline written in that bland, objective, Associated Press style. But now if you really wanted to create something that was going to be problematic, you could do that really easily. 2 minutes on ChatGPT. Tell it how long you want it to be, tell it what style you want it to be, tell it you want it to talk like a pirate, it will do it. It's very easy to do. Have it write a sonnet. It will write a sonnet in perfect Shakespearean form. You say, actually, I want a Petrarchan sonnet. It'll change it. It can do that work instantly. They're amazing. They're also, they're mediocre. They're not great. They're not Shakespeare. But they're good, you know, and if you were a student, it doesn't take much time to do that. Why write a poem when you could just have ChatGPT do it? So that's a real problem for news, and I think it's going to become a bigger problem for news. I would also argue that the conservative media attacks on the mainstream media have worked. And I think Barry Weiss is probably a sign of that happening. I think that when we look back to people like this, you know, speaking of Richard Nixon, this is his first vice president, the man too corrupt for the Nixon administration, Spiro Agnew, who was assigned to be Nixon's attack dog against the press. Right? You've probably heard nattering nabobs of negativism. Those words came out of his mouth. They were not written by him. They were written by William Safire, who went on to become a New York Times columnist. But Spiro Agnew was the vessel for this, for attacking the media. We started calling the media in this period, in the late 60s and early 70s, in part because bad faith critics who did want to tear down the American press started referring to what used to be called the press as the media, because for some reason that felt dirtier to them. So in this period, the press became the media. People like Reed Irvine, who founded an organization called Accuracy in Media, spent all of their time trying to attack the credibility of the mainstream press because they felt that liberal ideas got more time than conservative ideas. Messengers of the Right is a really good history of the conservative media and the rise of conservative media, which was a concerted effort to try to counterweight what they saw as liberal bias in the media. And all of that led to outlets like Fox News or conservative talk radio really becoming dominant. There was a push, and in the 1980s, when the FCC was deregulated and a news organization could spend all of its time focusing on one political point of view or the other, the conservative press really began to take off. And I think it was actually helped by what I think is a failure in the mainstream media. This is Nicky Usher. They now go by Nick Usher, who wrote a book called News for the Rich, White, and Blue. And this focuses on the New York Times. And it comes from the point of view of, I think, a deep love for the New York Times. And I have a deep love for the New York Times, right? It is the one news source I consistently turn to, but also it can drive me nuts. They get things wrong. There is a bit of a pandering to the middle. There's an attempt to try to bring conservative readers in by running conservative opinion pieces. But as Usher points out, the New York Times is largely written by people who are like the readers of the New York Times. That is, they're well educated, they're largely affluent, they are left of center, but still very much of the elite of the institutions that they support. They're institutionalist, center left. And that's really what the New York Times is. So rich, white, is in there, white people, and blue is in Democrats. And this is a really convincing case that by claiming objectivity in this period, starting with really Walter Cronkite, and maybe a little bit before that, people trace the rise of objectivity as far back as the 1880s. Certainly by the time we get to World War II, that had become the dominant strain of American journalism. But that so-called objective strain of American journalism really made them vulnerable to this kind of attack. Because every time they get attacked by a Spiro Agnew or a Reed Irvine who says, that damn liberal media is at it again, you can't trust them, it allowed room for something like Fox News to come in and say, we're a counterpoint, we're a counterweight to this, we're here to fill in what you're not hearing. And Fox will consistently say that they are not the media, even though they are by far, by ratings, the most watched cable news network, and probably the most influential news network in the US.
Why they typically literally go not news but entertainment?
I think you could make an argument that Fox News is largely, I'd call it infotainment, right? It is sort of outrage, and most of the things that people know on Fox News are not the reporters. They're not the ones that are actually giving information. It's the opinion people, the opinion hosts on Fox. That's most of what brings them to the ratings.
I thought they were actually registered in entertainment, not as news.
Well, what do you mean registered?
Or like through the SEC or wherever it was, they're not.
Well, they're a cable network, so there's no real requirement to define themselves. But they certainly see themselves. There were some internal memos. This might be what you're referring to. Some internal memos that essentially said, "Well, we're entertainment." Oh, it was in a lawsuit,
Right?
where they said, "Well, we're entertainment. That's why you can't treat us as news." But there's not really a legal definition.
But they say that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They absolutely. They will say that, but their marketing is definitely news. They call themselves Fox News. They market themselves as fair and balanced. And so I think that the way the New York Times addresses itself and says, well, we are news for everybody, we're the paper of record, we're right down the middle, has actually undercut their authority in some ways. That they would do better to acknowledge that, yeah, they're the New York Times, that yes, almost all of their journalists are college educated, master's degrees, that they are the experts in what they know. That yes, they live in places that are largely thought of as liberal enclaves. One of the things I do every year that I love is judge the National Magazine Awards. And in the judging instructions, most of the editors for the most of the judges for the National Magazine Awards are magazine editors. And the judges are asked to think outside of magazines that magazine editors read. Because if you're a magazine editor, you're probably reading The New Yorker, New York Magazine, The Atlantic, big sort of intellectual thought leader magazines. And they want to make sure that Good Housekeeping gets the same kind of treatment that something like The Atlantic does. And the way they phrase it in the judging instructions is emblematic, I think, of where magazine editors live. They say, try to judge magazines that are read outside of Manhattan Brownstone, Brooklyn, and Montclair, New Jersey, which hits very close to home now. But the fact is, Montclair, New Jersey is a wealthy, liberal, close-in suburb of New York City where a lot of media people live. It's a joke, but there's some truth to it. And this is a newspaper that is read in those places. It is still unquestionably the best news organization in the United States. Same for their sports reporting. So when we look at this, we have to remember not just that this is one little parenthesis. We get to this change. Now, some positivity, things we can do. It's not all bleak. I think some solutions here involve media criticism, media literacy, community journalism, and a real focus on the humanities. We were talking at dinner earlier about whether or not the humanities are dead, if this is a bust in colleges. Possibly, but there is some hope, and I think there's a real necessity for the humanities. So media criticism, one of my specialties, is plug for my book. That's my book on the right there, Provoking the Press, which was about a journalism review that ran in the 1970s. And when I say media criticism, there are two types. There's good faith media criticism, and there's bad faith media criticism. The good faith media criticism is the one we need a lot of. It's very hard to find, but these are people who understand how the press works, who can critique it when it's too full of itself, when it takes itself too seriously, when it's blind to things that are happening in the world. As this more was published in the 1970s, the subject of my book, at one of the last big crises of confidence in American journalism. At the time, reporters such as, there's a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter named Tony Lucas, who left the Times because he felt that the Times was too big and too stodgy an institution to be able to accurately cover the Cultural Revolution that was happening within the United States. Not the Cultural Revolution in China, but the revolution in sexual mores, culture, the arts, that those kinds of things were just not for the Times. So he left to be able to do more independent work and was a co-founder of this journalism review. That kind of criticism is really important. James Carey, who is a now deceased scholar, spent most of his career at the University of Illinois, was briefly at Columbia University near the end of his career at the journalism school, was a big advocate for what he called a culture of press criticism. And some of that was about making sure that we're always talking about what's going on in the press. Not just the gossip, not who bought which publication, who's been elevated to the new editor of Vogue, but actually thinking about the role of the press in a democratic society. Part of that, he believed, was education. He pointed out at the time, this is a joke that made more sense in 1973 when he published this essay, that we spend more time studying Homer, as in the blind poet who wrote the Odyssey and the Iliad, supposedly wrote the Odyssey and the Iliad, than we do studying Homer Biggert, which is a name you may not recognize, but he was a foreign correspondent, ended his career at the New York Times, very well-known journalist at the time, who hasn't really gone down in history, as most journalists do not. Although I believe I own Homer Biggert's personal copy of the History of the New York Times, which I bought at a used bookstore, and it has Homer Biggert written in little text inside. I think that was on his desk, but I don't know for sure. And what he meant by that was, we teach kids how to read poetry. We spend a lot of time in schools teaching students to be consumers of literature. But most kids don't grow up to consume poetry all the time. Some do. I think it's great. You should read poetry. Poetry is good for you. Poetry is a positive force in the world. However, people consume media, and we don't teach kids how to consume media, how to read media, how to know where it's coming from. It's hard even for me. And again, I have a PhD in media history, and I find it really complicated to know which publications to trust on a day-to-day basis. Some of them move around really quickly. I think of Newsweek magazine, for instance, which for many years was owned by the Washington Post company. And then you think, well, okay, Washington Post. And then it became independent, and lost a little bit of its cachet, as many of the news weekly magazines did. And then it essentially went out of business, but its name continued to exist. And it was purchased by some shadowy company that published news under the Newsweek banner because they owned the name Newsweek. But it had nothing to do with the Newsweek of the past. But if you didn't know that, if you're just like, oh yeah, Newsweek, I recognize that brand, then you would read Newsweek. Newsweek seems to be back. I forget who the owner is now, but now they're hiring journalists. They're hiring people I've known to work for Newsweek and do real reporting again. So do I trust Newsweek again? Maybe, but how do you know? It's really hard to rely on that brand. So I would advocate in the long run, and this is a long-term solution, that we need to teach people how to consume the media. That's what this is here, this SIFT. This is one method for deciding whether or not your media source is a good one. So stop, that's the S. Like when you read something, you're like, hold on a second, let me think about this. Investigate the source. Newsweek, I think that's a good source. Let me find out who owns Newsweek now. Where are they coming from? F, find better coverage. So if you're just seeing something on social media and there's no link, don't trust anything that doesn't have a link. If they don't link to the thing they're telling you about, it's probably made up. Might not be, but find out. Search for that story, find it somewhere else if you're not sure whether or not to believe it. And then trace claims, quotes, and media to the original context. Because remember, things can be pulled out of context. And now, of course, they can be completely faked with artificial intelligence. The last thing I'd advocate is a bit of a return to community. And I put up here the Center for Cooperative Media, which coincidentally is at Montclair State University. And if you're looking for one real reason I wanted to be a part of this, it is what the Center for Cooperative Media is doing. They are a group that helps small, independent news organizations across the state of New Jersey report on their own communities. These independent news organizations are poorly funded. They don't have networks. But the Center for Cooperative Media, through grant-making programs, through education, supports and fosters those groups and allows them to share information, to share best practices. They're a national organization now. It's not just in New Jersey, although their focus is still very much on New Jersey. One of the big problems in news right now is what we call news deserts, where the publications are going out of business, right? They're drying up. In Poughkeepsie, the Poughkeepsie Journal exists. It's owned by Gannett. It is one of those big news organizations. They don't have an editor. There's a regional editor who's in charge of the Poughkeepsie Journal, but they're just a few reporters. They cover some high school sports. They cover the opening of new fast food restaurants. It's not really covering the city of Poughkeepsie, and it's certainly not covering the immigrant population from Oaxaca, Mexico, because they don't have any Spanish-speaking reporters. It's not covering the immigrant population from Jamaica in Poughkeepsie. It's a community where there just is no news source because those newspapers are not paying attention. So things like the Center for Cooperative Media are trying to rebuild from that ground level. I will say Marist is also doing this on a smaller scale. A colleague of mine there has tried to put together about 7 or 8 small local news organizations to do something similar to what the Center for Cooperative Media is doing. So keep in mind, Walter Cronkite and Barry Weiss are ends of a very small era. It's this era of things that have built up where the norm of trusting the news was not always there. In the 1820s, you didn't trust the news because the newspapers were owned by political parties. Those were the political newspapers. They would attack Andrew Jackson, that's what this one is, as being a murderer. So that habit of trusting the news, of having confidence in a news organization for teaching you the truth, is a new habit. But also we're at the beginning of something else. I don't know what it is. I have a lot of faith that my students will figure out what it is. I have some confidence that journalism will continue. I'm a little bit worried about media industries right now because we have to pay for it. But journalism is still important. It's not the only important thing. But when we talk about saving democracy, I think we also need to talk about filling in the rest of that timeline. So thank you very much. That's all I've got. What questions can I answer for you? Yeah.
Snopes that does fact checking.
Snopes, yeah, Snopes.
The only one, or is there other ones?
There are a lot of independent political fact checkers. PolitiFact was a big one. Some of the other news organizations have internal fact checking. I mean, theoretically, all of journalism should be fact checking. Like, that's sort of what they do. If you're looking for a really good sort of introduction to the best practices of American journalism, I'd recommend a book called The Elements of Journalism, like the Elements of Style, by Bill Kovach and Tom Rosenstiel. It's in its 4th edition now, I think. And they lay out a lot of the principles of American journalism, including the idea that the essence of journalism is that it is a discipline of verification. What journalists should be doing is checking facts all the time. Somebody tells you something, you look it up. There's a famous saying in journalism schools and among journalism: if your mother says she loves you, that's where you're going. If your mother says she loves you, check it out. I have thought about making that an assignment in a class. Like, go find out if your mother actually loves you. I feel like that could go really, really badly, so I've never actually assigned it, but it seems like a good idea. What else? Yeah.
How do you account for, in the marketplace, for the success of the recent success, really, of Fox News came on 20 years ago? Fairly recent.
I don't think the success is really that. Oh, you mean the 20 years of success?
Well, where it is now compared to so-called mainstream media.
I think a lot of it is that they stoke fear and resentment, which have always been things that get people really angry. It's partly the same reason that social media succeeds so much. The posts that go viral are the ones that scare people or that make people angry. It's very rare that people just share happy, fun stuff, which is why on a lot of social media people say, well, this is a timeline cleanse, and they'll post pictures of puppies or rabbits, or like, here, look at some fun stuff to try to clear your brain of all of the anger and outrage. So I think that's a big part of it. I think that may also be part of the reason why conservative talk radio has taken off in ways that liberal talk radio never really did. There was a big experiment in it. It was called Air America Radio in the early 2000s. Al Franken, former Senator Al Franken, former SNL Al Franken was a part of it, as well as Rachel Maddow. It's really where Rachel Maddow became a national name, who my mom, who is not a straw man character, watches so much she just refers to her as Rachel. And yeah. Like, she's like, did you see what Rachel said? Like, I know who you mean, yeah. Yeah.
A comment along the lines of that. J.D. Vance, with the president, was telling a story about the patients eating people's pets.
Mm-hmm.
And when they finally cornered him and said, now that's been proven not to be true, why did you do it? His answer was, the only way we can get people to listen to us is by telling them outrageous things, so we did it to get their attention. And I think that's the rationale of Fox News.
Yeah, it's the moon bats. Yeah.
With young people being so much more media, computers, Instagram, all of this, you see paper still being...
No, no, not really. I mean, I'm already a relic, and I'm of an age where I grew up in a print world. The internet kind of exploded the year I graduated high school. I graduated high school in 1995. That was when the New York Times launched its website. That is when the internet happened. By the time I graduated college, cell phones had become something. And within 10 years, social media, smartphones, really accelerated. So in some ways, I feel like I'm lucky in that I've had both sides of that as that technological divide happens. It won't be paper in the future. I don't know exactly what it will be, but it certainly will not be paper. Books have done surprisingly well for some reason.
I can tell you, I live in North Carolina, and I got the Charlotte Observer, and then they went to leaving out Saturday. Okay, now they've gone to not even everyday internet. And it's horrible.
So they're not updating the website every day, or you mean?
No, you can get blurred, but if you register to do it, you can get the full paper. It's extremely awkward to use, and it's not every day.
Sure. Another one of the problems that what you said reminded me of is what scholars call disaggregation, which is basically just a big word for you don't get it all in one bundle anymore, right? I grew up in Dallas-Fort Worth area. My family subscribed to 2 print newspapers. We got the Dallas Morning News and the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and they were just always around, right? And you subscribed to them in part because you felt like you had to, but also because there was stuff in there you wanted, right? You wanted the recap of the Cowboys game. You wanted the movie times, whatever it was, weather, yeah. There was an information need. And then you accidentally got coverage of the school board meeting or coverage of a city council debate about tax policy. Nobody was buying it to read about tax policy. Very few people were. But now that all of that is disaggregated, right? You don't have to get it all in one place. You can just focus in on the things you really care about very deeply. And it means that people like the My Sister Scarecrow aren't going to accidentally come across that news. They're only going to come across the things that are penetrating at a national level or that show up in their feed. And the rest of it just kind of goes away. It also means that publications need to find new revenue streams because people were subscribing to these newspapers maybe to get the Sunday coupon books or the comics. But it wasn't that long ago you'd walk by a grocery store and they say, please do not remove the coupons from these newspapers, right? Because people just they'd take the coupons and leave instead of paying their $3, $4 and getting the newspaper at the time. So revenue streams are really important for them to find. The New York Times was really worried in the digital age because they didn't want to have a subscription paywall. They've done well with that now. But also they get subscribers through Wordle, New York Times games. People will pay to have New York Times games. It's a bigger revenue stream for them than news. I actually don't know that that's true. that was an offhand. I'm pulling that back. Yeah. Fake news. I'm sorry. I went for the cheap line rather than the verified fact.
Shameless.
I'm sorry. Throw tomatoes. It's all right. People pay for New York Times Cooking, the New York Times Cooking app, which is a separate subscription. People pay for The Athletic, which is their news, sports coverage, which my brother-in-law works for. They've hired all of the sports writers. Anyone who's a good sports writer works for The Athletic. Now, that's not entirely true. There are good sports writers who don't work for The Athletic, but they have hoarded them, right? They have taken money that they had, brought them all in, and then they charge you subscription to read The Athletic. So people are paying for that on Wirecutter, which is the product review service. And people pay for those things because the New York Times has found those needs. But if you're any other publication, if the New York Times has already cornered that market, where are you going to get your money? Because there's only so much appetite for subscriptions, only so much appetite for donations. I donate to a few publications. I do subscribe to a few things that I pay for. But boy, every time my New Yorker subscription comes due and they're like, it's $225 this year. And I'm like, that feels like a lot of money. And I love the New Yorker, but that feels like a lot of money. I'm a college professor. I get paid okay, but less than people tend to think. Although now that I'm at a public, you can look up how much I make. Feel free to find out.
But you have to mortgage and rent.
There you go. I got a mortgage and rent, and I also got to pay for a magazine. I can't do it. Especially, I donate to On the Media, which is one of those media criticism organizations, a radio show out of WNYC that is worth listening to. And the only reason I continue doing it is because they have one of those sign up to pay $10 a month and you get a mug. And I drink out of my On the Media mug, and it automatically, it's not worth canceling. I wanted to resubscribe and get the hat because the hat was cool. But I would have had to cancel and then get the hat. But then one of my students subscribed and got the hat and sent me a hat. So now I've got the hat too. So
I think we probably should wind it up and say that a lot of people around here after this would have wanted to audit classes at Marist. We'll have to figure a way to get to Montclair.
Yeah.
well, we're trying to promote what we call Montclair Unbound, which is online distance learning. So we'll have a way to do that too.
But thanks very much.
Thank you.